Well, first of all, Cathaoirleach, John Joe Fennelly and Minister Charlie Flanagan, Deputy Sean Fleming, Senator John Whelan and councillors and friends, could I first of all say that it's a particular pleasure and privilege for me to have been invited along this evening at the James Fintan Lalor School 2014. I want to thank the Chairman for giving me a mere 5 minutes. I will do my utmost to respect that. And being the first speaker, I realise I'm under a certain degree of pressure. So I have issued a script in advance, and it's far longer than 5 minutes, I can assure you. But I'm not going to obviously deal with that given the time frame available. But of course, we'll take questions later. I was first of all drawn to attend this particular school because, somewhat similar to what Diarmuid said, I think it's extremely important that we do engage significant figures of the past for reflection and understanding. And the most important thing to do is, and particularly in the context of James Fintan Lalor, he's received a respectful but somewhat brief mention, I think, in general histories, and could do with perhaps far greater study and reflection. And I think the initiative to hold this annual event is particularly welcome in that context. He's a fascinating personality. We can learn from his life and how he conducted himself. But of course, we need to be extremely vigilant of politicians endeavouring to interpret the past. That is a very, very dangerous thing, and it's something that in recent times I've spoken a lot about, the degree to which there's a lot of partisan commentary about the past with a view to trying to justify one's present position or the various orthodoxies and ideologies of contemporary times, and that is fundamentally wrong. I think you can learn from James Fintan Lalor in a more general sense in terms of general principles of life itself. For example, his letter to Peel on the repeal issue, in terms of, would sort of question perhaps, was this a person who was forever devoted to the concept of separation? He had different ideas around independence, but what it really shows is evolving thinking, evolving thought processes. The idea that you're not rooted to the same view for the entirety of your life, or indeed for the entirety of your political career. And therefore, that's an important lesson, that it's okay to change, it's okay to keep thinking, and it's okay to evolve your thought processes. And you may have a different position in 10 years' time to the position you have today. That's an important lesson. I think he was fundamental in terms of bringing the land and the nation, or the national question, together. And in many ways that terrified the British government of its day in terms of the powerful cocktail that represented at that particular time. His desire to improve the lot of those much less well off in his time is an admirable and noble idea that should continue to inspire people today. But let's also be honest, there's no need for nostalgia for that period. It was a period of neglect, of appalling poverty, and the lot of the tenant farmer and the labourer was an appalling one, and a very difficult one, obviously. And the contrast between social and economic conditions then bears no contrast with the modern state or the modern society that we currently inhabit, faults and all that it may have. And I think it's extremely important then that we draw lessons from that. And I think in the last 20 years in particular, I think we have learned a lot in terms of how we engage with history itself. The 1798 rebellion, for example, the commemoration of that was a good example of how we've learned that each party or each grouping should not try to possess or to interpret events that they're our events, that they belong to a particular tradition or a particular grouping. I think the fact that Aim Paisley was able to, for example, in a different context, to visit the site of the Battle of the Boyne at the invitation of then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern was perhaps the most striking illustration of how far we've come, perhaps, in engaging with our past. And that's important in the context of a nation once again. We're going to a series of commemorations and so on. It's very important that the shared nature of that is understood and properly celebrated. The visit of Queen Elizabeth and, if you like, her outstanding gesture in acknowledging our revolutionaries in terms of their fight for freedom was very significant. And likewise, our president acknowledging the role of Irishmen in World War I, which was a terrible war, which caused extraordinary devastation, and so on. But the idea of a shared history is extremely important to the concept of who we are and the community we belong to. And I've always been struck by that. Many families had people in the War of Independence who had brothers fighting in World War I. And at times, for years afterwards, one dare not speak of the other. And that is a flawed and in many ways a damaged history. So I think that's the challenge for us into the future. The other, I think, relevance of Lalor to the present day, I would suggest, is, as I say, how his thoughts evolved in terms of their views and their political programs to meet the realities of the conditions as they changed. They were internationalists as well. And my concept of the nation as it evolves is no longer just confined by territory. And that's important in terms of the all-island context. It's also important in terms of European context and also the globalised context we live in, which is something, the whole phenomenon of globalisation, we have not interpreted properly politically or in our thought processes whatsoever. Gordon Brown caused this latest economic collapse, which was on a par with Wall Street on a global scale, he said it was the first crisis of globalisation. And I think there's a lot in that. And I think there's a failure to understand the dynamic that globalisation represents and the degree to which it's changing our sense and concepts of nationhood again. I think you would describe Lalor as a modernist, an internationalist and a progressive in many ways in promoting the interests of all in society. I think we lack that ambitious spirit today. And I think it's reflected in the failure, in our failure to set out a clear vision for our future. We've had, and I don't want to get partisan politically or anything like that, but, the government has declared themselves as a national saviour. 7 years of tough choices are allegedly over and so on like that. But there are other forums where we can discuss that. However, I think at a more general level, the thing which is most striking is that I think there is no social or economic vision for the future of our society or our country. There are many small initiatives and even more big claims, but there's no central vision. The best small country in the world to do business in, which is a mantra we've heard a lot about in the last number of years. It's a good slogan, it's a laudable objective, but it's not a vision for a country. Having come through a traumatic period, which has challenged many basic ideas, the one thing we surely could all agree on is that we have a duty to tackle the more fundamental issue of what sort of society do we want to have, and the role of the nation in supporting this. And why are we not talking about, for example, the best small country in the world to grow old in, or to be educated in, or to be an innovator in? Why are we not talking about the centrality of community to our identity, and which I think is very much related to the concept of nation? How do we want to gain from and contribute to the wider world? I meet many younger people who are engaging. You meet a lot of people who are retreating. I think the response to Ebola is striking in that regard. The lack of response, in my view, from Western developed societies to that catastrophe is striking. Why not talk about the best country in the world to be creative in? The creative arts seems to be lost in the national debate in recent times. A minor refurbishment to the way that things have always been done is not good enough. And the failure to implement any significant political reform, for example, is simply inexcusable. The Irish political system has failed. I've been very candid in talking about that failure and our role in that particular failure. If we keep going with the current structures and balance of powers, then it will fail again into the future. We have a political system which, in my view, doesn't have sufficient expertise. It's not diverse enough. It does not empower the people's representatives to share responsibility for delivering good government. The Shannon debate was very illustrative in that regard. We had a combined weight of Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, Labour and much of the media, and they all failed to persuade the people, which is instructive, because their highly conservative vision of concentrating power in the hands of the executive collapsed as soon as it was exposed to scrutiny. The people said, no, we're not having that. So our country does need a deep and radical reform to its politics, and I think that's what the people were saying in that particular referendum. And until it's delivered, the bond of trust between the people and their government, in my view, cannot be restored. And we also need to go back to focusing on what the fundamental objectives of our republic actually are. We cannot allow a descent into cold managerialism, where you need a major reaction before public concerns are considered. And that's why there's no appreciation whatsoever of the value of community from the state. More and more communities feel they have to fight to maintain basic public services. Small example, we take small rural schools. I was there in 1970 to 2000 as Minister of Education. People came up to me and said, look, we should amalgamate small schools. I said, no. They're the heartbeat of our community. I actually increased the pupil-teacher ratio for one-teacher schools, two-teacher schools. Minority religions benefited. Many marginalised communities not only were surviving, they regained their viability. So I rejected that particular idea. And the idea being, and the great enemy here is efficiency. This idea of efficiency trumping community. And that is a problem in the modern era across the board. And that's something that I think we should challenge. And it's a factor in rural decline in particular. And our concept of nation, just as Lalor's was, and Lalor was very keen on this idea of rural Ireland, of the small landholder being central to our society and the type of society. In many ways, he felt it was more important than the oncoming industrialisation, acknowledging our weaknesses in that particular regard. So I think the 1840s was a turbulent and it was a destructive decade for our country. The problems of today come nowhere near their scale. However, when we look back, we can see core principles of Lalor and his contemporaries, which I think are still deeply relevant. Radical reform of politics, which he espoused, a progressive view and support for communities are themes which I think we still desperately need today and need to articulate very strongly. Thank you very much indeed.